Hey, folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 120 Critical Thinking. So, today we're diving into the material for Unit 3, where we start looking at the ARG conditions in detail, starting off with how to deal with premises and what to look for in acceptable premises. So, the plan for the day is essentially to run through the two main things that we're looking for here. We want to know when premises are acceptable in an argument, and we want to know when they're unacceptable. Because figuring this sort of thing out is the first step to identifying whether or not an argument is actually cogent and a good argument for us to be putting our trust into, or an argument that actually supports the point that we want it to support. So we're just going to take these two in turn, excuse me. We're going to run down the list of a few different features and situations in which premises are acceptable or unacceptable, and talk a little bit about what those conditions mean. So let's start off with a little bit more of a story, an analogy, to sort of illustrate the kind of thing that we're doing with this whole process. Because honestly, just when we start talking about premises and acceptability, it can be a little bit vague, the kind of thing that we're looking for. So I think a ordinary real life example is the best way to think about this sort of thing. Suppose that you're going car shopping after graduation. Suppose that Purdue degree really has been working out for you, you've got a fantastic job, and you're tired of driving the same thing that you drove through high school or college or whatever your life situation may be at the moment. Either way, you're looking for an upgrade. Now, there's a couple of different ways you might go about doing this whole thing. You might be like me, who is a compulsive researcher when it comes to any major purchase or thing that I buy. If I go on a vacation, I want to know everything about the area before I go so that I can make the most out of my trip. If I buy something, I spend far too long in the store looking at every detail and aspect of it beforehand. And the alternative approach is to be a whole lot more like my wife, who's fantastic and brilliant, but who very much enjoys winging it and exploring things as she goes. Now, regardless of how you approach things, choosing a car is going to be a bit of an arduous process if you use either approach. Whether you're looking for a car ahead of time and simply researching and looking at your various options, or if you just go and speak to somebody on the lot and see what sort of things they bring out, either way, you're going to be faced with choices on what sort of car to get. And some choices are very easy to make. When you go looking for a car, whether you're a researcher or an explorer, you probably have a few things in mind of what you're looking for. There's, for one, the basic components of a functional car. Does it have four wheels? Does it have an engine that works? Does gas go in one end and ignite in the engine and actually move the car forwards? Will it get me from one place to another? Does it have a steering wheel? There are basic things that you do have to watch out for at the really kind of skeevy used car lots. And there are other things that are just simple signs of quality. If you see a car like the one on the left that's beat up, torn up, the engine makes all kinds of strange grinding noises when you turn the car over and you get it going, these are things that are very obviously wrong. Whereas if you see something far more like the right, which is, for one, more expensive than I will probably ever be able to afford, and for some of you, possibly the same, but maybe it's the sort of thing you're looking for. There are obvious signs of quality, that the thing is beautifully made, that there are just aspects to the engine, the wheels, to the interior design, to every aspect of it that are just obvious signs of quality. Other choices are a bit harder to do. They're not nearly so obvious at times. Take these two 1970s cars. One of these cars is one of the most notorious ones ever made, the Ford Pinto, whose fuel tank configuration was set up so that in a certain kind of collision, the car would literally explode and catch fire. The other one is a fairly well received import, the rebranding of the Mitsubishi Colt done under the Dodge name, which was considered a solid car at the time. Now, if you're a car person, you probably know all about these and can spot these two things on sight. I, however, am not. I knew about the Pinto for sure, but I had to Google and make sure that another car that I pulled up for this example was not a Pinto. I had to do extra research to make sure I wasn't doubling down on the same thing. So, a lot of the features of these, a lot of the things that make one a fantastic car, at least relatively speaking, and the other one one of the most infamous vehicles ever made by an American auto manufacturer. These details are not always so obvious. The Pinto was not considered to be a failure until later in its life, when accidents started happening and explosions and fires started happening. So unless you know a whole lot more about automobiles and cars, you just simply may not be able to recognize the things that make one a better choice than the other. And we face similar sorts of issues when we deal with arguments and ideas. We are constantly bombarded with these things, whether it's be in advertising, in politics, or just members of your family, friends, teachers. You're constantly being bombarded with arguments for or against some position or another. I'm giving one right now, trying to convince you that you're bombarded with arguments by giving examples and saying that these things are frequent and that you can recognize them often and that this is something that happens a lot. By citing these kinds of reasons and trying to bring you around to a certain idea, I'm presenting an argument to you. And some of these are very obviously bad. Some of these have clear features that make them nonsense. For one, if you can't follow the reasoning, or if they just simply say totally irrelevant things, if you try and reason, well, the sky is blue today, therefore you should vote Democrat in the next election. Obviously, not a very good argument, because it gives virtually no, I would say absolutely no, support for that final conclusion. The first fact is simply irrelevant to the rest of it. Other arguments, though, are far more difficult to judge one way or the other, which is why we have this entire study of critical thinking. It's why we have such things as logic and a science of analyzing arguments and ideas and trying to have clear and specific things that we're looking for and that we can learn to recognize in arguments to judge them to be either good or bad, which is why we have the ARG conditions laid out in our book. Some time spent trying to learn to recognize the pintos of the argumentation world is time well spent. So, in this lecture, what we're looking at are things related to that first condition, the A condition, whether or not the premises of an argument are acceptable. Now, it's, excuse me, I jumped ahead a couple of slides. Quite a few. Huh. So, if we're looking at the acceptability of premises, we pretty much have one basic question to ask. When are premises acceptable? When can I actually say that this first condition, that I'm not selling pure nonsense when I present you with reasons for my conclusion, when are those actual acceptable premises? And there's a couple of simple answers that we can give, things that are kind of, well, no duh sorts of moments. The simplest answer for when premises are acceptable is when there are cogent arguments given for those premises. If the premise is the conclusion of a good argument, well, then you know it's an acceptable premise because you can just look at all of the reasons already laid out for accepting it. You can see and judge for yourself that it is, in fact, an acceptable idea, that this is a reason that is plausible and worth treating as true, or at least plausibly true. Uh, Another thing that tends to be very useful for identifying acceptable premises right off the bat are things that we can classify as a priori truths. Now, that's not a priori thing. It's literally a Latin phrase, a priori, that means from the first or from the prior thing. An a priori statement is one that can be known through reason alone. All you have to do is look at it and think about it, and you can recognize that it's an acceptable or true idea. Some examples of these kinds of things are like squares have four sides, or bachelors are unmarried, or mammals all have fur, or something like that. These are statements where the very definitions and concepts involved in the statement give all the evidence that's necessary to recognize them as true. They're called a priori statements because they're the sorts of things that you can learn and recognize through reason alone. You can learn them without having to go out into the world and do some secondary thing to you sitting down and knowing it. A good test of an a priori truth, in my opinion, is whether or not you can figure this out with an armchair and a dictionary beside you. Mathematics is something that you can do in an armchair with a dictionary and a large enough whiteboard to work your stuff out. So mathematical truths are largely considered a priori truths. These are things that can be known through reason and logic alone. Now, this is contrasted with a posteriori statements. And this is a Latin phrase, again, meaning things known from the secondary or the following thing, that is experience, because first we think about a subject and then we go out and look at it with our five senses, or more than five, since five's an antiquated idea, but you get the point. Um, when we talk about experience in this sort of context, we're not talking about like personal firsthand experience. Something that's known through experience doesn't have to be your experience. A scientist may have looked at it, or maybe it was something that was recognized centuries ago and it's just been recorded ever since. But the point is that we can classify statements using these two ideas, a priori and a posteriori, and a priori ideas are ones that you don't actually have to do any further experimentation or observation to recognize as true. So, along with things that have arguments already given for them, these are things that we can immediately recognize as acceptable, plausible ideas, things where we know or have good reason to think this is an acceptable statement to use as evidence. This is something that I can treat as plausible and believable, and I can rationally believe it. Posteriori statements are often like this, but not always. They require some extra thing to start verifying them. And it's from here that we start looking at more and more complicated things that we can deem acceptable. Now, another one that is somewhat immediate, but a little more suspect than the first two, are things that we can consider common knowledge. And when we talk about common knowledge, we don't mean that, oh, just lots of people think it. Common knowledge here, we're talking specifically about the things that almost everybody already knows, given the context that we're operating in. Common knowledge is going to be things like the sky is blue, or cats have tails, or other things that are not a priori truths, but they're things that don't need any further evidence to be rationally believed. For example, if you're one of those guys who just objects to everything that people say, or they like to play devil's advocate, playing devil's advocate about the color of the sky is something that generally is just going to turn a lot of people off. It doesn't seem rationally justified in the way that, say, playing devil's advocate about a complicated moral claim or a complicated mathematical proof might be. Common knowledge refers to the kinds of things that in a given situation, almost everybody is already going to know. However, it's worth noting that when we're talking about common knowledge, context matters a lot. There are some things that are common knowledge in one context that are not common knowledge in the other. Like, for example, it's common knowledge in our day and age that flight is actually possible, that there are such things as airplanes and helicopters and so on that can travel freely through the sky. That several centuries ago, this was not the case. There were large theoretical debates about whether or not it was actually physically possible for human beings and other heavier than air objects to fly the way that birds do. It was very much an open question whether this sort of thing was possible, given how much we weighed and our size and our non-natural suitedness for this kind of thing. So the time period in which we're operating in very much matters, and the same may go for different social contexts or which group of people that you're dealing with. Things that are common knowledge among, say, professional philosophers may not be common knowledge among general Purdue undergraduates. The joke I've got here on the screen is one that is dealing with common knowledge. It's assuming that, like the funny thing about the headline at the end, if there is something, is that this guy was missing some otherwise assumed to be common knowledge. But it seems weird to us because, well, it wasn't common knowledge. This guy didn't know anything about it. So the point overall, though, is that common knowledge is something that almost everybody knows. You don't need any additional proof for it, and so it's a good reason to treat something as an acceptable premise. But we do have to be mindful of context, and it's not as immediately obvious as things that already have good arguments given for them, or things that are a priori true. Now, Another sort of acceptable premise that we might look at, another reason why we might consider a premise acceptable, is if it's based on reliable testimony. And by testimony, we're not just referring to like legal testimony. We're not getting that specific here. When we talk about testimony, instead, we're talking about people's accounts of information just in general. So, talking to your brother about what he did last Saturday is a form of testimony, and so is hearing your teacher talk about historical events. Both of these are forms of testimony. One of them is a far more informed sort, while the other one's a far more personal sort of testimony. But both count for as far as the definition that we're working with. So testimony here means the reporting of information by some other person. Now, automatically, testimony does not make a premise acceptable. You could have somebody who is a liar or unreliable or just doesn't know what on earth they're talking about. So, premises are only acceptable on the basis of testimony if there are things that are generally not present. Like, basically, there are three flaws that we can look for and try and identify in somebody's testimony. And if we don't have those, we might have actual decent testimony and acceptable premises. Now, the three things to watch out for, the three things to worry about when judging testimony is acceptable or not, is the inherent implausibility of the claims made, the reputation of the person or source, and whether or not the claim that they're making goes beyond their experience or competence. So let's take, say, just a general idea of the physics of flight to build off of a previous example. Suppose that you're talking to two different people because you want to know how airplanes work and you want to know about the physics of flight. And suppose that you talk to your cousin Ed, who lives in a trailer down in the woods and has been on unemployment for his whole life and dropped out of school at sixth grade or something like that. Not meaning to disparage Ed, but I'm meaning to paint a particular portrait of this guy's knowledge of physics. And two, we instead might talk to an aerospace engineer from Boeing. Now, no matter how great of a guy Ed is, cousin Ed, he may tell you wildly implausible things about how flight works. He may talk about how people fill planes up with helium, and so that's why they go up into the sky. Or maybe he'll talk about giant birds that secretly come by and snatch the plane off the runway and lift it off into the sky. These are things that just on their face are very implausible. They're not likely to happen, so we shouldn't really believe them. We shouldn't treat them as a acceptable claim in the first place. We might also worry about Ed's reputation versus that of the established Boeing engineer. Ed may be the kind of guy who has a reputation for just telling wild and crazy made up stories. We all, I think, for the most part, have a cousin or an uncle or somebody who does that sort of thing for fun. You may be that person yourself in the family. That's awesome. But that reputation does undermine somewhat the plausibility and the acceptability of the testimony that's given. We might also look to the degree of experience and competence that a person has with a particular subject. That aerospace engineer is going to give far more acceptable testimony than your cousin Ed will. But if we ask that engineer, say, about religious claims, or if we dive into his political opinions, that engineer may also have no idea what he's talking about in those situations. So if we worry about experience and competence, we want to look at the specific areas that we're asking about and the topics that we're engaging in. Now, there's a special mention of all this, a special version of testimony that's worth spending a little extra time on, and that's an appeal to authority as a specific instance of testimony. And this is the kind of thing we get into with talking to a specialist engineer about the physics of flight or something like that. When we talk about authority when we're dealing with testimony, we're talking about someone who is an expert on a particular subject. And someone counts as an authority on a subject if and only if they are an actual expert in that area. Now, that doesn't require a particular degree or background. We're not trying to say that only rich or educated people count as authorities on given subjects, because on their own, degrees are not sufficient to be an authority. You can have somebody with very advanced degrees on a topic that really don't know what they're talking about, depending on how specific a subject is or what the quality of their education was. There's a lot of different qualities that go into that sort of thing. But it is worth noting that we want actual experts on a given subject. Simply citing somebody who's an expert in some things doesn't automatically make them an expert in everything, which sounds like an obvious thing to say. But when we're dealing with the acceptability of premises and judging arguments, this is something worth keeping in mind. We often talk to experts in various fields, like in particular, American news media has a bad habit of this, of talking to people who really are speaking outside their area of expertise. We may talk to highly advanced scientists about their political opinions, for example, which is something that they may be incredibly intelligent at. We may have some reason to accept their testimony. The claims that they make may be somewhat acceptable. But if we're trying to compare them to the ideas and opinions given by professional political analysts or by people with lots of experience in running and leading political organizations, that suddenly seems a whole lot less acceptable and a whole lot less plausible. Furthermore, citing or appealing to somebody's authority on a subject can make a claim acceptable, but only under the right circumstances. Uh, if we're dealing with highly trained experts on a given subject, and we're dealing with people who are experts in general on something, but the conditions aren't right, we can't use their authority as justification for the sort of premise that we're working with. Essentially, it's a question of how much can we trust a particular testimony given a particular subject matter. So, for example, take something like philosophy, which does not have clear consensus or easy answers to a lot of its questions. Things like, say, what is knowledge? Something that a lot of philosophers who specialize in the field of epistemology work on and focus on. Now, suppose you were to ask an epistemologist, we have several at Purdue. Uh, let's take one of them, say Michael Bergman in the philosophy department. Now, Professor Bergman is an absolutely brilliant individual. He has a lot of professional training in the area of epistemology. He has spent a lot of professional effort and time staying current on the literature. He's made contributions to the field. He is, by the first two criteria I list here on the slide, very much an expert on the subject matter and is reliable and credible on this in this area. He's somebody that we can trust the opinion of. However, the fact that he is an expert at this sort of thing doesn't mean that his views can automatically be treated as acceptable because he's an authority. Because epistemology is the sort of field where experts don't often agree on a given subject. Uh, Experts need to agree on the subject for the mere fact that they are an expert at it to actually give some level of credence and believability and acceptability to a claim. Professor Bergman has particular views about what knowledge is. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk with you about them. But without a consensus in the subject area, his views may be uh, vastly different than, say, another epistemologist. He may be different than Professor Brouwer's here in the department or someone else outside the university. And given the level of disagreement, we have no way of knowing which claims are the right ones. They may be experts, but without that sort of circumstance and agreement and consensus on the topic, the fact that they're experts alone doesn't make those premises acceptable. So just because you can find a expert on a given subject doesn't mean that everything they say is automatically an acceptable claim. Without these three conditions being met, uh, this, rather than being a way of making a claim acceptable, is instead a faulty appeal to authority. It's a mistaken assumption of acceptance or acceptability because the person is an expert. It's looking to someone who should be an authority on the subject but actually isn't, either due to circumstances, lack of ability, or both. Now, that sort of thing makes for a nice segue into unacceptable premises and claims. So far we've looked at a few different grounds on which we can judge a premise to be acceptable. We can say that ones that are backed by good arguments can be treated as acceptable. Ones that are automatically, sort of justified by themselves, a priori statements that can be known through reason alone, they need no further evidence that they're acceptable. There are things that are common knowledge that are acceptable, things that everyone knows and don't need further evidence based on the context and the situation in which we're engaging. And we also know that in certain circumstances, testimony can make a premise acceptable. And in particular, when we're looking at authority, we're looking at expert testimony. Um, Now, premises are unacceptable, or claims are unacceptable, not just when we don't have some reason to call them acceptable, but when there are particular conditions met for them being unacceptable. That is when there are certain traits that are present and met that make it to where we shouldn't believe the thing being said, rather than just a lack of reason for accepting it. Now, premises are unacceptable when we do have good reason to reject them on some sort of grounds like that when we accept them. One of the easiest ways to look at this, or one of the simpler points, is when we look at claims that are easy to refute. That is, there are claims that are easy to show that are false. Take something, say you're dealing with a friend who says something false about you. Like, suppose your friend starts talking about how, oh, you got in a fight with your mutual friend Jared last night or something like that. Well, you know whether or not you did get into a fight with Jared last night. And if you didn't do that sort of thing, well, then that's a very unacceptable claim. It's one that you shouldn't believe because you can easily show that it's false. You can simply give your own experience of the whole thing, and since it's your life, you should be the final arbiter of what you did and didn't do, at least under normal circumstances and all that sort of nonsense. Furthermore, there are other claims that are easy to refute or easy to recognize as being false. Just like a statement can be a priori true, that is, true by definition or can be known through reason alone, there are some claims that are a priori false. That is, there are some statements that can simply be looked at and thought about and shown to be either false by definition or self contradictory. Things like a round square. Uh, if I were to say round squares exist, if you truly took a minute and thought about it, the definition of a square is a four-sided figure with four right angles and four congruent sides and all the other things you learned in geometry once upon a time. But that means that it has to have four sharp corners to it. So a thing can't be both round and have four corners. So if I were to tell you that there are such things as round squares, you can automatically know that that's not an acceptable claim. That's not an acceptable premise to use in an argument because it is just on its own a priori false. There also might be premises that lead to inconsistencies between multiple premises, even if they don't have an inconsistency built into them. If you have multiple conflicting claims, this gives us good reason to treat a premise or a set of claims as being unacceptable when they start clashing and giving us contradictory accounts of what's true or what's real. We might also worry about claims that are too vague or ambiguous for us to really know what they mean. Like if I start saying that a particular car is fast, well, depending on the context that we're talking in, fast may not mean a whole lot, or it may have multiple meanings. So simply asserting this car is fast with no further clarification, with no further demonstration or proof, this actually starts giving us some grounds to reject that premise as unacceptable if we're going to use it in an argument. So, vagueness and ambiguity, if present, can give us good reason to reject a premise. We also want to watch out for premises that, quote unquote, beg the question. Now, when we use the phrase beg the question in here, we're not talking about the common way that this phrase is used. A lot of people use the phrase begs the question to simply mean something like it raises the question. Like if I talk about, oh, the findings of the so and so investigation beg the question of what Mr. Smith was doing on that Thursday night. That's not the sense we're using this phrase. When we talk about something begging the question, we're talking about a premise, that assumes the truth of the conclusion right there in the premise. So if I were to say something like, well, our textbook uses a nice example using skateboards. If I give a simple argument like, I have the right to use my skateboard in any public space, the Purdue Student Mall is a public space, therefore I have the right to use my skateboard here. That on its own is not a good argument. And in part, it's because that at first premise, I have the right to use my skateboard in any public space, is actually an unacceptable premise. It begs the question of the conclusion. Essentially, the only people who would believe that premise, the only people who would accept it rationally, would be the ones who already agree with your conclusion. It doesn't really give any additional support to your conclusion because, in a way, the premise and the conclusion are saying the same thing. They're simply repeating each other and assuming the truth of one when you really haven't done the work to show that. So, a premise that is circular in a certain sense, that has the conclusion built right into it in a way that it hasn't earned, this is something that we should reject as being an unacceptable premise. This can be a little bit tricky to pick out between a very simple and straightforward premise and a good or a valid argument versus one that begs the question. But I think running through some of the examples in the textbook would be the best way to look at those. Or if you have questions about it or any of this stuff, always feel free to send me a message. Now, as a final sort of note on material, it's worth talking about when neither of these things, a premise being acceptable or unacceptable, is going on. If a premise isn't acceptable, if it doesn't have one of the things that we've already talked about, that is, if it's not supported by a good argument, if it's not a priori true, if it's not common knowledge, and it's not given on the basis of good testimony, but it doesn't have any of the things going wrong with it that we worry about here, we do have a bit of a question of what to do. Thankfully, we do have a way out. If a premise isn't acceptable, but we don't have any actual strong reason to reject it as unacceptable, one thing we can do is provisionally accept the premises. When we're judging an argument as being cogent or not, as being a good argument or not, one that supports its conclusion in the right sort of ways, we can sort of give a pass on the acceptability condition, the A condition, so long as it passes the other two as well. So, this sort of thing I think will come up quite a bit in specific subjects in particular. There may be some specialty topic where you simply don't know a whole lot about the premises and the reasons being given. So, you may not be able to actually judge whether those premises are acceptable or not, except for just making sure that there aren't any obvious flaws in them. But you may not have enough info to judge them as acceptable. You may not know anything about the testimony, they may not be a priori true, and so on. If that's the case, we can still look at how the premises relate to the conclusion in terms of relevance, and we can also look and see whether or not they give sufficient ground for rationally believing the conclusion. So we can give a provisional acceptance of the premises and then provisionally accept the conclusion. Essentially, we say, well, I don't know for sure if these are true, but if they are, then I've got good reason to think the conclusion's also true. And so while we do have to sort of qualify our acceptance of the conclusion, we can still do so. That sort of provisional acceptance is a legitimate thing for us to do and have some rational backing to it. And that's about it. In the next lecture, we start looking at the relevance of the premises to the conclusion, which has a few more concrete things for us to look at instead of some simple examples of what's acceptable and what's not, or some good reasons to accept what's acceptable and what's not. And so we'll start digging into those in the next lecture. If you haven't already, start taking a look at the homework. You guys should be able to start working through the first part of it, the stuff for this chapter. And I think nail down these concepts a whole lot more through practice and repetition. As always, feel free to send me questions